Hello and welcome everyone joining us today for our webinar on My CPE. My name is Rachel and I'm joining you from Sugar Land, Texas. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. So before we proceed, I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. As we get started, please take a moment to ensure your audio and video are working properly. You should be able to see the screen and hear me loud and clear. If you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know in chat or questions panel, or reach out to us at support@my-cpe.com. We are excited to have attendees from all over the world. So please take a moment to introduce yourself and let us know where you are joining us from. Whether it's city, state, or any part of the world, you are most welcome to My CPE webinars. All right, let's see who all are joining us today. We appreciate your responses. I'd also like to take a moment to thank everyone for joining us today and supporting One Credit, One Meal, through which we donate one meal to an unserved for every credit earned. By participating in this webinar, you are making your continuing education more meaningful, and we appreciate your commitment to this cause. Please note that, as per regulations, you are required to remain logged into this webinar until the end and answer all the polling questions. An evaluation form will be sent to you within the next 24 hours after the completion of this webinar, provided you have answered all the polling questions. Well, this is an interactive webinar, and we encourage you to ask any questions you have in questions panel. We'll do our best to address them at the end of the webinar, if time permits. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and without any further ado, let's get started with our presenter. I'm excited to introduce you to Ashwath Muralidharan. He's a seasoned real estate technologist with extensive experience in commercial real estate spanning over a decade. Currently leading a business development and strategy at Nakisa's integrated workplace management solutions, he specializes in real estate portfolio management. As a certified product manager, he has contributed significantly to build two innovative enterprises. So let's hear more from our presenter about himself and his presentation. Thank you again, Ashwath, for being with us today. And without any further ado, the stage is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the kind intro, Rachel, and welcome everyone. It's an honor and joy to be presenting on the topic of lease management today, and I truly hope you'll find my content insightful and helpful as you go about your day-to-day operations. First off, I would say thank you for opting for this webinar, for continuing your professional education. I know technology has become inseparable from most job functions, including accounting, finance, real estate, or otherwise. So I hope this topic is very timely wherever you sit within your organization. What I will be discussing today has a lot of applicability, even broader than lease management software selection. So I'm sure that there are relevant threads for you to consider for other enterprise software as well that you use for your everyday work. Rachel was kind enough to provide a great intro for me, but just as a little bit of precursor before we start, I have over a decade of experience in the commercial real estate technology space. Specifically, I've spent a considerable amount of time with Fortune 1000 companies, helping them with technology operating models, process design, technology roadmaps, and also selecting best fit systems and hand-holding through implementation and managed services. My experience with large organizations has shown me both the good and bad of implementing software to manage real estate, capital projects, and facilities. And I really hope to share some of that wisdom with all of you today. Now, specific to today's topic and around lease management, I've spent the last 5 or 6 years recommending and deploying leading point and IWMS solutions, including the company that I work with right now and their software, Nakisa, to several customers in North America and even broader. A lot of what I'll be covering today touches on my personal learnings from these implementations. So with that, let's jump right in. I wanted to set a little bit of context around our learning objectives for today. The learning objectives, as you will see, are very straightforward. The 3 bullets that you're seeing on screen here is what I'm looking to accomplish along with all of you attending. I'd first like to define the scope of the lease management function for global enterprises, large or small. Then we'll briefly look at challenges faced by organizations today before jumping into the age-old build versus buy dilemma, and also common misconceptions associated with build or buy. Lastly, we'll take a step back and look at a better and a tested approach to implementing lease management software. And then finally, double click into a hypothetical case study and a few examples around cost structure and potential gains from implementing the right type of software, but also taking the right approach before implementing the software. Finally, I'll also leave you with a cheat sheet for software selection, which I hope all of you will find useful. It's from my experience as a management consultant and having gone through this process with a lot of large customers, that this process that I'll be discussing today is in front of you. So I'm excited to get started. So with that, let's actually jump right in. The first part of our discussion is around defining lease management, as I mentioned. So what I've done here is I'm going to take a brief minute to read out an industry standard definition of lease management as it stands today. So lease management, also known as lease administration synonymously, is the comprehensive management and execution of contractual obligations related to a company's lease portfolio. It involves systematic oversight on all aspects of fixed asset management, plant property or equipment, and includes, and certainly not limited to, managing aspects prior to execution and signing of the lease through negotiations, and then during the lease's life cycle, managing everything from critical events, terms, payment conditions, documentation, and even compliance-related requirements. Now, the key phrases to note here are comprehensive management of contractual obligations, which I would say is an operational necessity for any enterprise dealing with hundreds or even thousands of leases at any average day. The other important item is oversight on all decisioning aspects for your fixed assets. And this is mainly to ensure that your life cycle events are controlled from a timing and a cost perspective. And the last bit, of course, is compliance, whether it's now financial compliance standards according to ASC 842, IFRS 16, or even data privacy and security laws, cybersecurity standards, accessibility standards, or even more broadly, industry-specific regulations around managing a leased portfolio. Those are the aspects that are typically ones that fall under lease management. So to that end, lease management comprises of multiple functions that roll up under what's broadly coined by the industry as portfolio management, both within large enterprises and among software vendors that are servicing this market. So before we double click into lease management, let's spend a little bit of time on understanding what portfolio management is, so that we are able to put lease management in the context of portfolio management, and then start looking at some of the decisions around software specifically for lease management. Before I jump in, I'd also like to indicate that if there are questions coming in, I might not be able to see them immediately because of my screen sharing. So Rachel, if you could be kind enough to let me know, feel free to interrupt. I'll be happy to take questions as they come in as well.
Sure.
Thank you. Great. Let's look at portfolio management. As I mentioned, the extra time that we spend here, essentially in this graphic and context, sets the stage for the rest of our discussion. At the outset, portfolio management means different things to different people. In the context of lease management and real estate management, portfolio management is the holistic oversight and the handling of an organization's entire leased or owned asset portfolio even. which may include a diverse range of real estate properties, fleet, equipment, IT, whatnot, right? This is comprehensive management approach that real estate functions take within an organization, and it encompasses all these different functions necessary to optimize the performance and the compliance of leased or owned assets throughout their life cycle. Let's look at each aspect of portfolio management. Some of these will be very immediately relevant to the functions that you as individuals within these organizations perform today, and others might be adjacent to your role and function. Planning and budgeting. It primarily involves forecasting and allocation of financial resources necessary to manage a company's portfolio. It includes things like assessing future leasing needs based on business growth or contraction, calculating potential costs associated with new leases or renewals, and setting aside appropriate budgetary provisions to cover lease-related expenses during any fiscal year. Effective planning and budgeting ensures that an organization can meet its real estate needs without the financial strains or curveballs during the course of any fiscal year. The next is transactions management. Transaction management within the context of lease management refers to the oversight and handling of all activities, including the acquiring, modifications, dispositions of leased assets. Now, this includes negotiating lease terms, securing approvals from finance, legal, conducting the right due diligence activities, and all the way up to executing the lease agreement. The goal here is to ensure that all lease transactions align with the company's operational needs and the financial strategies that are set upfront during planning and budgeting. The next sort of 4 tiles or functions are all related to lease management functions. And those are the ones that we'll be focusing a lot more on for today's discussion. If we take lease inception, this is the place or the phase, I would say, where a lease agreement is established and activated, right? It begins with an initial proposal and negotiation. So in a way, it has an overlap with transactions management. But the reason this is important to be separated is because this sets the foundation for what data is abstracted, what gets populated into systems, and the terms for occupancy, for payments, and for critical conditions that govern a landlord and tenant relationship at the end of the day. Lease administration, it encompasses the day-to-day management and operational tasks associated with the portfolio of leased assets. And it includes maintaining accurate records of all the documents that are set up during lease activation, monitoring critical dates, things like renewals, expirations, option triggers, etc., and also ensuring compliance with lease terms during the life cycle of an asset. So even things like reassessments, amendments, which are financial in nature, end of term activities, or escalation events around the market or the terms with the landlord are all decisioned around the lease administration aspect of lease management. Payment processing and reconciliation is a direct handoff from your administration activities, where term-wise payments are made out to the receiving parties and reconciliations are done at the end of a period, be it a quarter or a month or an annual event, especially for the example of reconciling common area maintenance and those types of charges. Lease accounting is a big bucket on its own. Lease accounting can be its own topic, but in the context of lease management, it has a natural adjacency because for public companies, largely, the proper recording, tracking, and reporting of all financial transactions related to leases in accordance with applicable accounting standards such as ASC 842, IFRS 16, or GASB 87 even, are all ones that fit under the functions that software providers or even in-house systems address from a lease accounting standpoint. It includes things like calculating and recognizing lease liabilities and right-of-use assets, expense scheduling, preparing disclosures about leasing activities for financial statements, etc. Effective lease accounting, which is sort of the big picture summary of all of lease administration activities, is crucial for compliance with financial reporting requirements, as I mentioned, and also for providing internal and external stakeholders the transparent insights and the financial implications of lease commitments and entering into lease commitments. So The reason I wanted to spend more time here is because each of these components play a vital role in the management of lease portfolio and ensuring leasing strategies are effectively implemented and aligned. And for this discussion, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the light blue zones. Moving ahead, I won't spend a ton of time on this, but whether it's a large enterprise or a small enterprise, for that fact, lease management can be accomplished through several operating models. It can be in-house, it can be fully outsourced, or even a hybrid. Software used can adopt multiple technology models as well. You could have point solutions that perform solely lease management activities, or multi-point solutions for that fact. You could have integrated workplace management systems that cover lease management in the context of facilities, projects, ESG, and even the workplace. Or software can also be procured through service providers, especially in situations where the function is partly or fully outsourced to a third party. Procurement through a third party is a typical engagement model. And lastly, large enterprises that also have a solid foundation through ERP systems typically leverage some of the adjacencies a few leading ERP systems provide from a lease management perspective as well. And certain ERP modules cater to the lease management functions for these types of enterprises. So there are different process models, there are different technology models. Today, I'm not going to discuss the benefits and pitfalls of those models, because that's, again, a whole topic in itself. But what we're going to look into are the activities that then nourish the decision behind selecting a lease management software itself. So those activities are what are outlined here. I won't go into these activities, but some of these you may already resonate with from what you do in your job function day to day. But in short, these are almost a roster of major activities that need to be checked before you can say job done from a lease management perspective. Now, with all that said, looking at the day-to-day operations, there are several challenges that come into play, that come into mind. I'm aware these activities are not new, and these challenges are not new to most, if not all of you, and that challenges abound even beyond this list. But in my practice as a management consultant over the last 7-8 years, a recurring way for me to narrow problems down using the first principles approach is to first identify the foundational buckets that these problems or challenges might sit in. And today I want to talk about that aspect of approaching the whole dilemma about lease management software selection as well. So most, if not all, problems fit into either people, process, technology, or even data type of issues. And in some cases, they could be a combination thereof. What you see here is a list of recurring themes most of my clients have faced and have shared in the context of managing leases, whether it's incoherent or inaccurate data, lack of timely access to data, lack of portfolio visibility, and very reactive reporting as a result of lack of access to data, or even managing terms, conditions, clauses, options, etc., becoming very inadequate or cumbersome because of the fact that there's no data centralization, or the system is not able to handle the bread and butter operations. So the challenges are a result of that analysis. And a lot of you are probably living with these issues as we speak today, even though you might have enterprise-grade software systems and even smart people on your site to handle these operations. You're probably relying on a lot of your smart folks to navigate the system limitations or software decisions to actually get the job done. And that's the dilemma that we're trying to address and work around in today's conversation. So that said, what we're going to do over the next, I would say, half hour or so, is to try to solve for the root causes for these challenges, and for which we need to first break a couple of myths surrounding lease management software decisions. So let's look at some of these myths. And even before we jump in, I'd like to maybe pause at this point and get us into polling question 1 to set some context. Great. Another 10 seconds and we close, but it's very interesting to see these results. There is a big portion of responses that are pointing towards, I'm not sure, and a sizable amount that's pointing towards manual work using spreadsheets and documents, which is typical, which I can understand why you're here today. And let's talk about how the movement from manual processes into an in-house system or into an enterprise-grade software that's configurable off the shelf would look like. Perfect. Now, if we proceed, let's start looking at the crossroads aspect of lease management in this context. But before that, Rachel, I just wanted to check if the poll is closed and we're good to proceed.
Yes, we have received our responses and polling question is closed now.
Okay, great. All right, awesome. So as I was mentioning earlier, in past consultations with a lot of my customers, the primary decision for selecting a lease management system often revolved around whether to build or buy software. And if the inclination was to buy, it was typically narrowed down to a few options, either identified through primary or secondary research or through expert recommendations. Additionally, I also encountered recurring questions that reflected common misconceptions about the process. So let's jump right in. There are a couple of myths and realities that I want to talk in the context of lease management for both build and buy. But let's start with the first aspect. When we look at the first myth, building gives full control over software features, upgrades, and scalability. This is largely untrue because of a couple of reasons. When you're looking at generic tools that are repurposed for specific needs, these are rarely easy upgrades. They achieve specific business functions, and to actually get to the adjacent business functions that you might be looking at, or to look at completely polar opposite business functions to get full control over even the development cycle, becomes a bit of a tough exercise. An example here would be a recurring theme that I've seen, which is when generic CRM systems, which are robust, enterprise grade, and even widely recognized for CRM capabilities, or ERP systems, which are promising certain adjacencies that cover real estate or portfolio management, are repurposed for lease management functions for complex organizations. The native design of these systems, although they're really good in their core functions, does not allow management of complex agreements, workflows, and real estate financial compliance needs as effectively. So that's the first myth around building and the reality associated with that. The second myth, which is around buying, is the assumption that buying inherently increases security and offers expanded data structures for tracking and centralizing real estate data. Now, vendors need to qualify for several cycles of external checks and balances to actually stay true to industry standards and guardrails. And only a few leading ones clear benchmarks and the moving targets around compliance and security. For example, various benchmarks, including achieving SOC 1, SOC 2 type compliance, and adhering to regulations such as GDPR, EU specific, require a lot of effort. And only the leading emerge successful more often than not. So it's very important to understand that buying merely doesn't solve for security and compliance, and that it's a journey that needs to be done, taken along with the vendor during evaluation, and then constantly revisited. So that's the reality around buying. The third is around building. So building allows development projects to be easily prioritized, controlled, and accelerated. And this is a myth because internal resources, as you all know, face competing priorities from core business operations more often than not. It's almost obvious, but mostly always forgotten, that internal resources, whether it's real estate or IT, are assigned on projects that are more core to their job role, their functions, and the leasing system implementation becomes almost a value add or an afterthought once the project begins. This impacts timeline, scope, it creates reason for negligence as well, which needs to be carefully evaluated before system selection. The fourth myth is that buying off-the-shelf software is more costly or expensive than developing a solution in-house. Now, this one is interesting. We will be going deeper into this because I know cost is a top determinant when buying software. the misconception is very common, but the key phrases to note here are that the strategic purchase and unforeseen FTE costs, because both of these items will alter the equation significantly in favor of buying, especially if you have solutions that take care of your day-to-day needs at the most mature extent possible. The last myth is around building. Building ensures seamless integration with existing enterprise systems, given knowledge already prevalent, right? Prevalent within the organization. So integration in itself is a hot topic. The reality is that custom-built solutions often encounter similar integration challenges as systems that are built right out of the gate to solve for your needs. And in fact, the biggest driver for implementation is so that data can be integrated across systems, across your organization, and a single source of truth can be achieved. So even though internal IT teams may hold a great deal of knowledge around integration methodologies, be it through APIs, through webhooks, middleware, flat files, or even SDKs or software development kits that will then form part of integration operations, selecting the right approach to integration and providing the concept before building integrations, or proving the concept before building the integration, probably has the largest positive impact on successful integrations. So to me, this myth favors neither side, but it needs very neutral consideration, whatever we decide, which actually brings us to the next portion, which is around specific practical insights that we can start looking at and how these myths can be broken and the right balance achieved during lease management software selection. But before that, let's maybe open the poll up again for another question to understand where all of your current state is in terms of your challenges as well. 2/3 of the respondents, and it looks like integrations is leading the pack right now, which is actually interesting. But another key observation is that compliance, regulatory changes, and data are close behind. So it's almost a 25% split across the different topics that are here, which to me says that all of these are very important and close behind one another. So we'll maybe give it another 30 seconds and end the poll. All right, great. So now that we have that insight, and I'm glad the audience is with me, and there is resonance in terms of the challenges that are being faced and whatnot. But let's start solutioning in the remaining time that we have, and for which I want to get into some practical insights and go back to our first principles approach of bucketing your organizational considerations and concerns into a few areas: people, process, technology, and more today than ever, data. So let's look at each of these areas one by one and see what are the top considerations that we all need to take in terms of even getting ready for the right type of software deployment model within the enterprise. And let's start with people, right? So the first thing is knowledge of the organization. So whether it's evaluating if your team has the right experience needed to develop and manage a complex software system, or considering your historical success rate, really knowing your organization goes a long way in terms of understanding the appetite to build or buy a software. And then close to that is the support and collaboration internally, right? Like, and these are aspects that are softer, harder to determine, but things that require repeat attention before knowledge of whether a company is ready for an enterprise grade implementation that may span 6 months to a year and a half, depending on the number of modules and the scope of effort, right? So knowing whether teams have a track record of collaborating effectively around technology is a big factor. And I think that's becoming more and more important at C-levels as software starts to take over and AI starts to take over how we all work and how we all collaborate around technology. And finally, transformation readiness. If your organization is already undergoing a transformation, that's a larger business transformation, whether it's an ERP change, a merger acquisition activity, or a new product line or product suite that's coming out, or a new area of growth, whether it's geographically or economically, it's important to understand if a lease management system can supplant that growth or expansion, and if there is a need now more than ever, since a lot of you mentioned that manual work is what's currently or manual approaches are being taken into effect in terms of managing your portfolio, is now the real time to move into a software selection process. So that's the people aspect of implementation. Next, if we go into process, this is where your asset types start come into play. A lot of large enterprises have portfolio complexity that's across the gamut, whether it's just merely size, or if it's the complexity of your geographical presence, or if it's even asset types. If you're owning, operating, managing, leasing, multi-asset types, multi-asset categories within commercial, or a combination of commercial, residential, and different stakeholders that are involved, different center of excellence teams, leadership teams, and sub-leadership teams that are dispersed, and the frequency of changes. How high touch is your portfolio? Understanding that complexity is really, really important. And sessions around workshopping for understanding this, getting people on the same page, knowing roles and responsibilities clearly becomes super important, which brings us to the operating model definition. To me, having worked on operating model designs for a lot of large customers, defining the functions within an operating model, understanding your hierarchical structure, understanding your organizational structure within your operating model, with clear functions that are going to be performed in-house or outsourced or a combination, is really going to be important to accommodate new responsibilities when a system comes into place. And all of this feeds into, after knowing your people, after knowing your operating model, understanding your processes. So whether your current processes still work, or if there's an emphasis that's needed on streamlining the process around leasing, and if implementing a system will effectively support where you're heading in terms of your North Star as an organization, is super important as it relates to knocking out the process aspect of software selection. And some of these we'll get into a little more tactical in terms of the steps that large organizations are recommended to take, just based on my past experience and observations in the market. But at this point, it's just a sort of food for thought in terms of things to consider, tying back to our root areas that would have a big impact in the longer run. Lastly, in terms of the buckets, technology and in context of technology, data becomes super important. Not all organizations sit at the same level of technological maturity. So gauging your current tech stack, gauging your current tech maturity, are teams equipped to deploy software at a rapid pace in a structured manner with full security compliance, or are teams still struggling with internal implementations or past projects, and even legacy software that are monolithic, and things that are very difficult to move out of, such that it makes it so much easier to buy a system off the market that caters to over 80-90% of your needs, and then configure or custom for the remaining percentages, is an element to consider under the light of technology maturity that your organization might have. And this is where the CIOs, the CTOs come into play, because they have a really synthesized view into understanding your tech maturity as an organization, and your IT teams know what will work, what will not work for your adjacent functions. So bringing them on at an early stage becomes super important as a consideration. Also, knowledge of existing systems. You may have existing systems which natural adjacencies. I know I talked about a couple of models where ERP solution providers, or point solution providers, or even IWMS providers might be present within your organization with other functions providing other software that might have a natural synergy to lease management. For example, you could have a lease accounting software, and adding a lease administration software on top of it using the same vendor might give you some sort of natural advantages around integrations, around data management, and so forth. So knowledge of your tech stack with respect to existing solutions and other functions becomes super important. And then last but not least, is data management, right? To me, having spent so much time in the real estate industry, one of the biggest detriments around effective reporting, centralization, source of truth for real estate data is not even the fact that data is not managed well, but it's the fact that organizations don't know what data they have or not have. And that's what I'm defining here from some of the stalwarts who've already gone ahead and defined the term as dark data. So dark data is both knowledge or lack of the information that's not existent in the organization, and knowing how to bring that information to the light. So considering your data maturity and complications to leverage data, whether it's lease data, whether it's portfolio performance data, whether it's headcount data or space usage data in the context of lease data, defining what data you need and understanding where you have it, how you have it, and where you can bring it from become super important factors in terms of determining what software can get you most of the way, if not all of the way. So all that said, let's start looking at a couple of tactical examples, right? Like what I presented right now so far is almost a 20,000 feet level consideration. But now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's look at some operational examples. Total cost of ownership, as I mentioned earlier, is a big factor. It is almost the big elephant in this virtual room of system selection decisioning. And this is where the lines almost start to blur in terms of whether you build or buy, you pick an incumbent, or you pick a new vendor, or you go after a large established vendor in the market, or you go after a smaller one that's up and coming and that's more nuanced. So what I want to list out here, and as you're seeing on the screen, are some recurring factors that make up most of the costs associated with lease management systems. Now, while these factors remain more or less the same, whether you build or buy, it's the contributing elements that actually vary. And let's take a look at a hypothetical company X, right, with global presence, leasing more than 1,000 assets, primarily as a tenant for our intents and purposes, requiring integrations to their ERP, to their BI tools. They would want to integrate for payments, for journal entries, for reporting, analytics, whatnot. And they're estimating about 25 or so, maybe even more users for lease management, covering both lease administration and lease accounting functions. So if this company, considering these cost factors, decides to build, there are certain cost considerations that naturally come into play. At every stage of development, there is a design, build, test, deploy cost. Now, whether that's coming from contractors, whether that's coming from internal teams who are FTEs, who perform other functions like IT, technology, or real estate even, there is a cost associated with peeling away people from their core functions into doing the build activity. And then data around implementation, both the data cleanup, data governance, and data migration are big cost factors that are almost always hidden and only start to surface when the actual work is being done. You might know you don't have data, or you have too much data that is unstructured, or you might also be struggling with mapping the data. So all of these truths start to come in only during the build cycle, and they make up a large portion of the implementation costs during the build cycle. Licenses are not as heavy on the build side as opposed to the buy side, but they don't go away entirely, because you still have dev tools, platform components, database, hosting, and even ad hoc software that needs to be procured to support an in-house build. When you buy, you typically see an active or a concurrent user license that's encompassing most of what you need, or if not all of what you need, and maybe even certain connectors that might be licensed or priced separately. But there are several bells and whistles with respect to licenses that impact both build and buy. So the cost almost remains more or less the same if you look at the big picture. And I'll show you a bit of a comparison right after this as well to put things in context. But as we progress thematically, integrations, we talked about this a lot already, but integrations is another factor where building still continues to require requirements gathering, design, build, test, deploy, any middleware associated with the integration. So bringing all those into the forefront requires a lot of work, FTE time, cost considerations from a tech perspective, and even working with other teams, adjacent teams that might have the other half of your integration that you would need to coordinate with to actually make sure your integration works well, whether it's from your leasing system to your ERP, or your leasing system to your BI tool, or even from your transaction system to your leasing tool and whatnot. Typically, when you buy, especially from strategic vendors, you have integrations that are covered largely within the professional services side of things, or you have certain enablements like integration methodologies and approaches that are naturally provided by these vendors, and they help you with the integration process more often than not. But the work around carefully considering what you need for integration still remains the same. Then there's PMO and change. I don't have to spend a lot of time on this. We talked about process, but requirements definition is again and again the most important thing, to put process before product, and designing your process, enablement, making sure people are okay with the change that's coming in, managing the tactical elements of a project, whether it's timelines or risks or concerns, etc., are both factors to consider during build or buy. Even during build, companies, in my experience, typically hire an external project manager who can stay neutral, who can stay sort of unwavered in the context of everything that's going on, and sort of support the organization from an outsider perspective. But during build cycles, you typically have professional services that comes along with these vendors. Either vendors in-house provide professional services, or they have external agencies or third parties that come in and do the PMO and change portion of the work. And then, of course, there's ongoing costs for support, enablement, and if there is an enhancement, there's a build, design, test, deploy, or design, build, test, deploy associated with that. And you will see that within the build cycle, this is almost like a mini implementation cycle outside support. But for the buy side, you will see that managed services typically covers a large portion of this, including bug fixes, patch fixes, periodic upgrades, etc. Again, the key phrase here is the right vendor for your organization and the right vendor for your goals will meet a lot of this a lot of the way. And of course, certain enhancements that might change based on your business decision, based on, let's say, a large acquisition where a big sizable portion of your portfolio is coming into your purview or oversight, will impact how much ongoing support is needed from a vendor as well. So there are costs associated with that. And then lastly, there's contingencies. Contingencies from a buy perspective are mostly scope associated or customizations associated, before which you need to reserve some money in the bank. But with respect to contingencies around build, there are customizations, again, similar to buy, but also backup and recovery, disaster management, legal and compliance contingencies, warranty contingencies that also need to be considered, which all impact the total cost of ownership. So if you look at this picture, take a step back, you will see probably what I saw when I put this together, which is the fact that there are a lot of considerations which are inherently going to factor in as hidden costs when a software is being built. Now, the argument here is that buy cycles may also include a lot of these if inefficiencies are encountered, right? By selecting a vendor that's not a good fit, or by selecting a professional services team that's not a good fit, or a combination, or the lack of. So what I would like to do is next show an ideal scenario where build is, in comparison to buy, a slightly disadvantaged position. And this is under the assumption that when a lot of the ducks are in the right row, organized, such that you have certain priorities set up front in terms of what needs to be accomplished and how it needs to be accomplished, and have clear view into your people, process, technology, and data considerations and goals, then the buy cycle becomes a lot simpler, more linear, and much less expensive than the build cycle. So if you look at each of these, we talked about each of these considerations, but you'll see that implementation cuts down significantly because the FTE time for a large part goes away because of a third party that comes in to take over most of that function. Licenses, as I mentioned, could stay comparative, but this is again a conservative view, but you might be able to gain efficiencies with licenses through your build cycle if your build is purely internal and not expansive to other software that you would anyway have to procure. Integrations will more or less remain the same because there are dependencies to other teams, but you might get more hand-holding and help along the way with the right vendor or the right expert that's coming in to support that work. PMO and change from an internal perspective, because internal structures already account for a lot of the PMO aspects of building a software, are much lighter when you buy, but it's still not a big offset. Because you still need the cadence, the methodology, the structure, and the approach in terms of managing your implementation with the right PMO methodologies as well. And ongoing, very naturally, is much cheaper from the buy perspective, typically, because you're not treating those mini implementation projects as standalone when you do the buy cycle, because a lot of the components of your buy cycle cover automatically the aspects of upgrades, patches, fixes, biannual reviews of your software, compliance checks, etc. So from that perspective, your ongoing cost becomes considerably smaller in the buy cycle than the build cycle. And then, of course, the contingencies are comparable, but as I mentioned to you earlier, the contingencies also taper down from a buy perspective than a build perspective. So with that, I also want to quickly show one example of a case study where one of our customers went from an in-house to an Nakisa solution. Again, I learned that the material will be shared, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you'll see here that for a Canadian discount retail chain that also has a subsidiary in Latin America, a large portfolio, again, over 1,500 stores, and they were deploying an in-house solution that was cumbersome. The knowledge was limited to one or two people within the organization, and moving to Nakisa Real Estate and lease accounting gave them a lot of freedom in terms of addressing some of the key requirements like global visibility, reduced risk of errors, accounting compliance, and even cost efficiencies from the integrations perspective, some of which we looked at a little earlier. Great. Now to the last part that I promised. This is a cheat sheet, so definitely use it to your context and advantage, but also with a grain of salt. But this is put together with the goal that certain considerations that stem even from before a software is selected will go a long, long way in terms of ensuring a successful program, whether you decide to build or buy lease management software. So let's start from the left. The first is justify your need, or justify the actual need by understanding your current state truly, truly well. The second aspect is identify and plan for your global portfolio and think ahead in terms of other business activities that might impact your current decision to build or buy software. So identify all the opportunities that might present in front of you and all the risks also that will then inform the scope and the budget that is set aside for software selection. Once those two are out of the way, hone in on the business requirements. So be very diligent, be very critical on what your must-haves are, what your should-haves are, what your nice-to-haves are. See if all of those need to be met at the same time, or if there are certain critical needs and must-haves that need to be met to inform your 2-3 year business cycle, and then go on incremental approaches. So knowing exactly what you want goes a long way before even vendors and software developers are engaged, whether it's build or buy or build. And in this particular case, if we look at the buy, sourcing the software becomes a natural next step. So initializing RFIs, preparing vendor scorecards, attending multiple demos, running trials, or even proof of concepts to select the best fit and the final solution becomes very important. And a lot of what I mentioned is kind of brought into perspective only when the right software and the strategic vendors are selected. And you may still face some of the problems around the build cycle, even in the buy cycle, if monolithic legacy applications are continuing to sort of plague your organization or your function, right? So it's really important to select the right software from a buy perspective. And lastly, from a buy perspective, and then I'll go into build, is implementing the software effectively. So mobilizing a PMO, monitoring how the vendor is performing and whether goals and deadlines are being met, testing, and I can't kind of stress this enough, but SITs, UATs, unit testing, going through that cycle with a lot of diligence and cadence with the vendors go a long way in making sure that your must-haves and your critical requirements are met effectively. And at the end of the day, the message is stick to your requirements. If there's any source of truth or anything that you would need to fall back to, it would be the requirements that you developed at the start of the implementation cycle. So all parties involved in the implementation can be honest about what is needed and what the end goal is. And if we bring in the build cycle to this, just to look at how some of these steps change, as you'll see here, the first 3 stages really don't change in this cheat sheet, but the last 2 steps are where there's a big change. When software is ready to be implemented, mobilizing your development team in terms of determining the tools that are needed, refining your budget, allocating and freeing up people so they can focus on this work, and also building out an internal RACI matrix. So responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, knowing who and which function is falling under which aspects of the RACI become really key, and then engaging internal, external parties and finalizing their roles, whether it's third parties building certain portions of your software or people in-house doing different portions of that work becomes super key. And flowing into building your own product, there are a lot of considerations here, but just a top couple of considerations. And one key takeaway is to retain the knowledge, or try to somehow retain the knowledge that is developed during the build cycle after the software is implemented, such that either people don't leave, or the knowledge doesn't get diluted, or the way of usage of the software changes so much that the initial knowledge is no longer relevant. Those are things to take into consideration. So let's open up the third polling question here. I see some promising responses in terms of considerations that are very active. So I hope this presentation was timely for those of you who are very likely to consider changing or selecting a software in the next 12 months. And for the others that are still determining, this is just food for thought in terms of how you would like to proceed with your approach moving forward. But with that, in the interest of time, I'll end the poll here and close out with a couple of thoughts around where Nakisa is, where my role has started to sort of take shape within the organization, and what we're looking to achieve over the next couple of years. Just as a quick preview, we are Fortune 1000's software choice for solving problems across 3 lines of businesses: HR, real estate, and finance. We build innovative SaaS solutions for large enterprises, and we are entirely cloud native in terms of our architecture and our infrastructure model. We offer by native integrations to a lot of the major ERPs out there. And we also take security, compliance, and privacy very seriously, and meet and exceed standards on a recurring basis very consistently. And lastly, but not least, we're product-led and founded by our CEO, Babak, who has been a visionary behind a lot of the big initiatives that we're taking as an organization. And we're also a global player for customers across the world. In terms of our product portfolio, Nakisa has a product portfolio that's enabled strongly by our open cloud platform, our HR core, which runs our workforce planning product portfolio. There's another webinar on agile teams and our workforce planning that you can find in our YouTube. And from a finance core perspective, we have our accounting product portfolio and our IWMS product portfolio. And a lot of what we discussed today in the context of lease management sits within our IWMS product portfolio, with some overlap on the accounting side with our accounting product portfolio as well. Here's a quick preview into our IWMS product portfolio. We make up a lot of the functions that are performed during the whole life cycle, even beyond portfolio management. We talked about portfolio management running from planning, budgeting, all the way to lease accounting. So that's covered in our real estate portfolio management suite. But we also have a dedicated capital projects management suite and a facilities management suite that are new and have entered the market. And all 3 product suites are, again, powered by our finance core capabilities, which is common, leverageable, cross-leverageable, I should say, and our open cloud platform, which provides the API services, which provides our integration capabilities and microservices to that end to all of our product suites. But with that, I hope everybody found this presentation useful. Feel free to reach out to me at any time via LinkedIn or email. And I thank my CPE and Nakisa for this opportunity. Thank you. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on My CPE. I hope you found this session informative. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our presenter, Aswath, for sharing his expertise and insights with us. Aswath has been one of our best presenters, and we are always thrilled to have him on our platform. Thank you again, Aswath, for this amazing session.
Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate the support.
You're most welcome. One more important thing, everyone, to get your credit certificate, you will receive an evaluation form within next 24 hours after the completion of this webinar, provided you have answered all the polling questions. If you have any further questions or need to view this recording, please feel free to email us at support@my-cpe.com. Once again, thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience. We appreciate your participation and hope you'll join us again for our future webinars. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Stay safe and stay healthy. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.